Well, let me thank our wonderful musicians for so many things that connect with what I'm actually doing this morning. As a teenager, one of my favorite rock bands was the Rascals, led by composer Felix Cavaliere and lyricist Eddie Brigati. They hit the charts in 1967 with soulful ballads that earned them more play on black radio stations than many white bands usually got. Their songs also took on racial justice themes. In one, they observed about the 1968 presidential election that bigotry, hate, and fear got 10 million votes this year, but law and order won. That, of course, was a reference to the showings of segregationist former Alabama Governor George Wallace and Republican Victor Richard Nixon. While I appreciated the group's efforts at fighting racial animus, I now realize one idea the Rascals promoted carries within it a danger that I see to the fight for racial justice. In People Gotta Be Free, they sang, "If there's a man who is down and needs a helping hand, all it takes is you to understand and pull him through. Seems to me we gotta solve it individually, and I'll do unto you what you do unto me." That notion that we can solve our racial problems individually resides at the core of the book I'm completing and will soon offer for publication. I contend we're not doing badly on individually right now. Black people and white people get along just fine. Lots of white people offer helping hands to blacks. I've been a beneficiary of some of those helping hands. Yet, racism persists. Racism that suppresses black votes, that permeates every aspect of our criminal justice system, that keeps blacks behind in nearly every measure of economic success. It's when we look at the whole of our society that our seemingly intractable problems become, well, intractable. The title of the book is The Dollarway Syndrome, What Some of My Best Friends Are Black Really Means. Deception and dishonesty buried within that old truism connect my book with the 1971 Norman Whitfield Barrett Strong composition, Smiling Faces, you heard at the outset. No, smiling faces sometimes don't tell the truth. Parenthetically, the subtitle isn't in stone and it might change as the process goes on. I am, however, dedicated to the main title, The Dollarway Syndrome, because that's rooted in specific experiences that I have with the subject of the book, the differences between individual and group approaches to race. In 1969, I graduated from Dollarway, a small high school in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. I have named what I write about the Dollarway syndrome because I saw first there white people enjoying, even cultivating, positive relationships with black individuals, while at the same time harboring discriminatory attitudes and intent toward blacks as a group. I saw this throughout the intervening 50 years. I see it today. The book details my experiences and offers my explanations grounded in my training and experiences as a journalist, communications scholar, and lawyer for why it exists. And foolish though I may be, at the end of the book, I suggest some possible remedies for this problem as well as for America's racial ills generally. But let's start at the beginning. Understanding my experiences at Dollarway High School requires understanding the state of school desegregation in Arkansas and the South generally when I enrolled there as a 14-year-old sophomore in 1966. Dollarway found itself in the same position as many Arkansas and Southern school districts. From one of two sources, they were under pressure to do away with their dual school systems in which blacks and whites attended separate schools. As we know, in 1954, the United States Supreme Court decided Brown versus the Board of Education. Brown held separate schools based on race unconstitutional. In a series of cases that followed, what lawyers would call Brown's progeny, the court ordered an end to school desegregation with all deliberate speed. That unfortunate phrase became a key tool in the arsenal of Southern school officials who sought putting off the day of reckoning as long as they could. The reckoning, of course, was full, complete desegregation with unitary school systems. Districts like Dollarway got sued in federal court by black patrons of the district, while the United States Department of Health, Education, and Welfare launched administrative proceedings against other districts. So, either from the federal courts or HEW, Southern school districts face intense pressure to desegregate. They also face just as much pressure from their white patrons to resist. These districts came up with a delaying tactic that A, worked for a time, B, produced desegregation in name only, and C, finally became unsustainable. That solution was the Freedom of Choice Plan. It survived through my high school years, but both the courts and HEW finally rejected it. Freedom of choice desegregation plans rested on a basic, fundamental understanding Southern school administrators had of the people in their districts. They knew almost no whites wanted school desegregation, and only a few blacks did. Now that sounds harsh in the light of the 21st century, but it's true. If it weren't true, at least some of the white parents in the Dollarway district wouldn't have sent their children on a 40-minute bus ride past black schools so they could go to mostly white schools. If it weren't true, there would have been more than 3 blacks in my graduating class of 1969. Under freedom of choice plans, students could pick whatever school they wanted in a given district. Well, what's more American than that? What happened, of course, was that all the whites picked the school that had always been white, and all but a few blacks picked the school that had always been black. That pattern repeated itself throughout the South between the mid-60s and the end of the decade, when the Supreme Court in Green versus County School Board of New Kent County finally said enough is enough and outlawed freedom of choice. HEW followed suit, and by the early 70s, freedom of choice had been condemned to the history books. But freedom of choice prevailed in the Dollarway district and many other places until I finished high school. It's within that experience that I first observed what I now call the Dollarway syndrome. A few of you who've been in writing groups with me know that when I arrived at Dollarway, I was assaulted by rock throwers on my first day. For a variety of reasons, I don't dwell on that now. It happened, I moved past it. The truth is, Dollarway, in its own way, moved past it too. As I point out in the book, when discussing the incident, for the most part, high school turned out for me like high school does for most people, a time of growth, challenge, and the frustrations and anxieties that go with adolescence. The racial part of Dollarway that really impacted me lies in what I write about in the book. That's the part that I haven't forgotten. At Dollarway, generally, my white schoolmates treated me well. I maintained friendships with many for years. The relationships that slipped away did so for the reasons that always destroy early life friendships: distance, changing interest, family obligations, just the passage of time. I don't think race had anything to do with the erosion of any of my high school friendships. I don't have black friends from Dollarway I stay in touch with today either. The important racial aspect of Dollarway is that most of the white students with whom I had those good relationships kept the hostility they had toward racial equality that they had on the day I arrived at Dollarway, their relationships and experiences with me notwithstanding. I believe that remains the modus operandi for many American white people: openness toward individual positive relationships with black people, but continued hostility toward racial equality for blacks as a group. Now you ask, what evidence do I offer for this proposition? Though there is much more, I am compelled to give you at least 3 compelling pieces. First, There's my experience at Dollarway. The book has plenty of examples. I will recite today just one. The glee, and that's the right word, the glee with which many of my schoolmates reacted to the 1968 murders of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. The reactions I'm talking about didn't come from the school's confirmed known racists, the ones who just couldn't wait to throw around the N-word. No, they came from fellow students who had shared with me what I call high school experience, people who helped me with group projects, people who worked closely with me in extracurricular activities, people who confided personal stories. In other words, people who've been my friends. Second, there's the story of my broadcasting mentor, which I detail in the book. Some of you know I started my professional life in radio and later moved on to television. The reason for much of the 10-year career that I enjoyed in broadcasting lies in what I learned from a man named Tommy Riggs. He was program director of the little radio station I started at and one of Arkansas's most accomplished radio men. Tommy taught me much of what I needed to know about on-air radio and television work. As important as Tommy's instruction was, his constant boosting of my confidence and his relentless promotion of my career made the real difference. This was small-town Arkansas in the 1960s. Tommy must have been a progressive man, you might think. Well, if you do, you're dead wrong. In the 1968 presidential election, Tommy voted for George Wallace. For those of you who don't know how bad a man George Wallace was on the issue of race, I will gladly stick around after the service and enlighten you. Finally, there's the parallel between Tommy's relationship with me and the relationship between a prominent white businessman and sports figure with other black people. In fact, his story finally pushed me over the edge and made me decide I'd write the book after years of thinking about it. Robert C. Bob McNair founded and owned the Houston Texans, our NFL team. McNair's public record on race was, being kind, unfortunate. In response to black players kneeling for the national anthem, for example, he said that he and his fellow owners couldn't have the inmates running the prison. He supported an owner the league penalized for his use of the N-word, among other transgressions. But when McNair died in 2018, stories emerged about all the assistance he provided to black players in the development of their business careers after football. His hiring record reflected an uncommon sensitivity to the needs for black participation in NFL front offices. It was just like with Tommy and me. McNair was fine with helping individual blacks, but his attitude on broader racial issues left, shall we say, much to be desired. So why does this exist? I spend 4 chapters consisting of 45,000 words and 460 footnotes offering potential explanations. I survey what I call the race discrimination literature, in which I describe the work of sociologists, political scientists, journalists, social psychologists, and legal scholars who have identified various aspects of racial animus. Since Unitarian Universalists read a lot, I imagine at least some of you had heard of the theories that I discuss in this part of the book: white rage, white privilege, white fragility, microaggressions, the list goes on. Some of you have likely heard, perhaps even read, some of the work of authors that I cite: Tim Wise, Robin DiAngelo, Ta-Nehisi Coates, the late Derek Bell. I studied political discourse in graduate school. I see understanding it as essential to understanding the way Americans view race. I devote a chapter to how modern presidents, those since the Second World War, have communicated with the nation about race in campaigns and while in office. I hope my observations about the role of interpersonal and public communication on racial attitudes will make a real contribution to the national discussion on race. Now, I'm not going to tell you all my conclusions. If I did, you wouldn't have any reason for reading the book, would you? I will say this about the last chapter, the place I reveal what I see behind the Dollarway syndrome and what it means in our overall racial milieu. Some of you are likely familiar with Outliers, the Story of Success, a 2008 book by social commentator Malcolm Gladwell. The book is probably best known for its suggestion that real competence in any endeavor requires 10,000 hours of actually doing that endeavor. It's the 10,000-hour rule. Outliers, however, contains another important observation, that catastrophic events like airplane crashes seldom occur from one thing. Air disasters usually result from a string of small incidents that pile up. Take any one out of the equation, and the accident might not happen. Such, I believe, is the case with the Dollarway syndrome. After combing the racial discrimination literature, performing my own analysis, considering the factual, legal, historical, cultural, political, and other circumstances that I found significant, I think the Dollarway syndrome results from a multitude of factors at work in our society, not one thing. My book represents an attempt to explain what those are and therefore lead to thoughtful consideration of how we take those individual factors out of America's racial equation. I will today share some of the things I now see as essential for an attack on the Dollarway syndrome and our racial problems in general. The most common question people ask when discussing race discrimination, at least those who want to do something about it as opposed to perpetuating it, is, what do I do? I will therefore offer 6 ideas for what we do about race in America and therefore the Dollarway syndrome. First, create and promote an educational system that teaches an honest history about race in the United States. Now, this has gotten harder because of pushback from the right. They found a convenient boogeyman in critical race theory. Almost none of the people whining about it would recognize it if it walked up to them and hit them over the head with a baseball bat. Well, I do know what it is, and I explained it in my book. And I can assure you, it's not being taught in any public school in Texas or anywhere else. We can't let this straw man prevent American students from learning what's really happened about race in this country. Parents and everyone interested in public education must insist we tell the sorry truth about our history. Only after we do that can we have honest conversations that proceed from an historically accurate set of facts. Second, read, study. Just before I started law school, I asked a lawyer friend of mine for advice about surviving the ordeal. He gave me 2 words I'll give you. Read, study. I've composed a list of books I think people who want to claim they understand race in America should consider reading. The list, which I'm refining all the time, will appear in the book, and it may look a lot different when it gets published than it does today. I gave my friend, Mr. Shantz, an advance copy, a preliminary copy, because of his position with the church's Social Justice Committee. He might trade you if you help him on his committee. Third, broaden your circle socially. This, I admit, is an individual solution, but some group good may come of it. One of the most interesting statistics that I unearthed in my research for the book was a Public Religion Research Institute study that found 75% of white people in the United States have exclusively white social interaction. Blacks aren't much better, 65%. Hispanics are least exclusive at 40%. No wonder we're suspicious of each other as groups. And we know little about each other, so what happens is that stereotypes persist. And no, people from work don't count. This means getting out of your comfort zone. It means discovering the virtue of cross-racial friendships. It means risking seeing and hearing things that might create unpleasant feelings within you and among your same race friends. It may also make you a better person. 4, governmental leadership. Well, my guess is that Unitarian Universalists, those who don't live in ruby red counties, particularly like this one, probably do pretty well on this score. It's no surprise that candidates showing the greatest sensitivity on racial issues get black votes. What would happen if white voters also made racial sensitivity a part of their criteria for determining who they'll support? This has become important to me since a Dollarway classmate I consulted with about the book told me she had never given a thought to what impact the outcome of an election had on black people. And she's one of the most liberal people in the class. 5, talk about race and don't complain about it. I could tell a story, which will appear in the book, about how someone at this church showed me the importance of this little admonition, but I won't. Suffice it to say that the white aversion to talking about race must end if we're going to do anything about the Dollarway syndrome and our other racial problems. In truth, Americans who are not hiding under rocks have about as much chance of avoiding discussions about race as they have of avoiding our now endless political campaigns or the presence of the National Football League. Call out, finally, racist acts and statements, especially group stereotypes. You know what I'm talking about. In an all-white gathering, somebody makes a derogatory comment about blacks being fill in the blank of your negative characteristic as a group. There are no blacks around. The fact no white person objects is a major reason the Dollarway syndrome persists. I didn't invent the Dollarway syndrome. I just observed it. It's possible in writing about it. I've done no more than make something simple very complicated. If that's the case, well, so be it. I had to do this because the issue has nagged at me for 50 years. And therein lies the significance of one of the verses Carol read this morning. 8 Jeremiah 20. The harvest is past, the summer is ended, and we are not saved. Now, I confess, I stole this from one of the late Derek Bell's books. But I doubt Professor Bell would mind, especially if my use of his formulation helps people see his point. No, we are not saved. For all we have done, for all the advancements we have made in my lifetime and in the lifetime of every person in this room and every person watching this virtually, on this matter of race, we are not saved. We have much, much more to do.